Yo, what's up guys? I already left a video with my initial feedback from the Shadow Priest talent tree, which should hopefully be in a link like right here. But I wanted to revisit it and give something a little more concise now that I've had time to sit down and look at it. I also wanted to give a few theory crafting builds that I've come up with so far of how we're looking right now. Again, I don't expect this to be the final tree, and obviously we're very pre-alpha, so this isn't looking at any balancing or stuff like that. It's mostly just looking at how the tree feels, how it feels at points in the tree, and what I would like to see from it. Other than that, let's go ahead and hop on into it. Alright, so I want to get started by looking at the class tree itself, and I won't really be going over every talent here. There's other videos for that, there's other times for that. I want to keep this a little bit more concise and just look over the things I find good, I find bad, specific talents I want to take a look at that seem interesting or seem a little bit out of place. But I think what we're going to start with is just the general overview for this tree. It feels like it's very low impact. Well, I shouldn't say low impact. It feels like it's very defaulted, right? So we're always going to be wanting these two capstone choices, and there is just a sudden build you have to follow to get those, right? You always have to start with the Shadow Mend, go straight down here to this, straight down here to this, and while also keeping the points in to make sure you can go to the next tree. Like, from what I see right now, is we will almost never change from this tree that we see right here, right? Like, there's not really any choices. Like, there really aren't even any good off-hill choices we can put in. Like, the most we can do is maybe we can give up, like, Leap of Faith and Angelic Feather, which why would we ever give... We will never give this up, let's be honest here. We can give up, like, Leap of Faith to go something over here. We can maybe, especially in more of, like, a M+ setting, give up the Mind Games and the Tithe for something more like the Dominant Mind for the Mastery playstyle, or maybe even the off-healing if these talents prove to be strong enough to want to put early points in. Like, the biggest issue is obviously we're never going to... Like, we never expect to reach the good healing down here, but I would like to see these abilities feel impactful enough to sometimes want to take it for off healing, right? Other than that, yeah, the utility is another big issue, and the utility is something I'm going to talk about a lot here because utility in this tree feels really bad. The class tree and the shadow tree later, it just feels like there's not a lot of choices with utility. But for the most part, we just do not have ways to take utility, right? We don't even have utility we can really take here. We have Leap of Faith, which we'll always take. We'll have Angelic Feather, which we'll always take. And then we basically have a few points we can maybe switch Leap of Faith to something over here, right? If we need Shackle, or if we need Mind Control, stuff like that. But there's just... It feels like there's so little variation in how this tree is going to go. As for the specific talents, the first thing I want to look for is Death. I still don't think there's a reason for this to do damage. I think it doing damage and self-damage, it's good in PvP, because it at least has some use. It's a cool thematic thing, but overall, in PvE, it's just a archaic mechanic that makes it feel bad for us to follow a rotation. One thing I want to talk about here too is why is Body and Soul still a thing when 95% of the time I'd say Angelic Feather is just objectively better. Like, you can argue it's harder to use, but you just use a cast itself macro and your only worry is if the server thinks someone else standing on top of you is the one getting in instead of you, right? Like, this is just inherently almost always going to be better and just going to be so much easier to use, right? Than Body and Soul will. As for... I want to address the TOF thing real quick, because we still see that this doesn't say damage. If this does do damage as well, because obviously this is currently a stronger version than we have on live, it's a really good buff to execute, but that's something we need to hear more from Blizzard, right? Make sure it's actually doing damage, because if this is only healing, that is going to feel very bad for Shadow, right? Like, a little bit degeneracy actually having to heal people and have people below 35% health, versus just getting our usual execute ends, but again, I like to believe this is supposed to say damage. As for this right here, I can see why this is here. It doesn't feel terrible to take this, but it doesn't feel amazing to have to put points into Mind Restraint just to get to a road that we have to go into. Obviously, this is part of the... This is more of a disc, maybe holy talent. It's kind of like that healer hybrid punishment, so I'm okay with it. I would just like to see this have a little bit more proponent with Shadow, but it doesn't need that much address. This is why I would usually talk about the PI stuff, but I feel like that is beating a dead horse at this point. The opinions on PI are out there. I personally, in theory, it's okay. In practice, really not healthy for the game right now. There are ways to make it healthy. I'm not going to go into those right now, but I would still like to see PI overall removed and reworked into a different type of cooldown, or at least the non-self-cast proponent taken out. But that's an issue for another day. Other than that, I feel like this isn't horrible, though. I actually do kind of like the Priest generic tree, other than just the lack of feeling that I have choices to make here. Because really, there are no choices to make here. It's you need Shadow Flame Prison, and in single target, you need Mind Games, and AoE, you can maybe take Dormant Mind or a little bit more utility, but that's about where the Priest tree ends, right? Alright, next let's actually hop into the fun part of this tree, the Shadow Specific part. So, first off, the overall, I talked about this a little bit with the Priest class tree, but it definitely extends to Shadow, is that just there was very little good utility we can take here, right? Like, you have the Mind Bomb, Psychic Voice. Both of these are very subpar, not very impactful utilities. You have the Silence, which is already just... We'll talk about it later, but worst interrupt in the game, in my opinion. And you have Dispersion, because all of this is good utility over here, once you actually get points into. Obviously, you have to go through the Mind Seer, but it feels bad. And you have these over here that just... These aren't abilities. These aren't talents. Vampiric Embrace is way too weak to be worth putting this many points into. And Hallucinations was always a very nice thing, but especially now that you don't have Body and Soul, it loses so much of its value. There was no reason to put points just to get Hallucinations, right? It just feels kind of bad that it's still here, especially with this many points blocking it. And the other big complaint I think I have about this overall is it's very incoherent, right? Like, if you look at some of the other talent trees, there are very clear paths for, like, AoE, single target, stuff like that. But then when you look at the Shadow tree, over here we have our AoE kind of go down, which would be, like, the Shadow Crash, the Echoing Void, and all of that, Living Shadow. Like, those are the components I can kind of see having AoE value, but all of them are just locked behind these Cleave abilities you would never press in pure AoE. And it's the same for, like, a lot of the Cleave stuff, right? Like, one of the biggest components I see of Cleave stuff right now is this idea of the Idol of Yogg-Saron and just being able to pump out apparitions for summoning that. But it's just infinitely far away from all of the other shadowy apparition talents, right? I will talk about that more when I get to the bottom row, but it just feels generally like this is a very incoherent tree when it comes to trying to make damage profiles. And there are a few things that it's still not answering that I would like to see. One of the big names being the amount of insanity we generate for how little it's worth to cast it. Like, again, even when it was worth to always never cap on insanity in SOD, we were still capping or close to capping on insanity just because of the pure amount we generated. And there's more generation in this build that I see. Like, we have more Shadow Fiend, right? With the... Well, not to mention that SFP is now a default thing that we will always have, so that's something that's going to be a core part of our build going forward. We'll just always have this huge insanity problem. And this, instead of addressing that, adds more weight against insanity. Like, it adds a tunnel called the Void back in the Idol Cthulhu, but it doesn't actually answer the insanity issue that we saw with a tunnel called the Void when we started entering SOD, where it loses so much of its value purely because you don't need that extra insanity. You're already generating too much, especially in CDs. And the other thing I see, capstones should be this thing, at least in my mind when I look at a talent tree. The capstones are what make the build, right? Like, you should see this cool single target capstone, like we'll take the Idol of Yogg-Saron for an example. That, if that is a single target capstone and it has this huge value in single target once you summon your thing from beyond, that should be the capstone. This is the endpoint of my build. It should be strong enough that no matter what, I know that I want this. But at the same time, you need to feel good getting to it, right? Because you're going to go for it no matter what. But if you have to put so many points into Abyssal Knowledge, this... I'm going to buff Mind Flay, a filler ability that really is not fun to even press. It feels bad to go for that capstone. It doesn't make a meaningful choice, per se. Like, you can argue there's the meaningful choice of you have to take a bad talent to get to a good talent, but to me, that's not a meaningful choice. That's I have to do something unfun so I can get to something that is inherently the best and that I have to have for the build, right? Like, it just feels really bad when there's all these random, like, Sanguine Teaching and Mental Fortitude being the force in for both of the idols over here. It feels bad to put points into those two things. And I'll talk about them a little bit more later, but it just feels bad to have to put this many points in to get to our capstone defining talents. And, like, this goes back to the incoherentness. I think what I would overall like to see them do to this is kind of make a left, middle, and right tree. It's kind of like where maybe the left is like this full AoE focus. You're looking for burst, AoE, things that aren't going to live a long time, or huge target counts. The middle be more like a middle ground Cleave thing. You know, Cleave will always have a little bit of value in single target because usually it will enhance your single target abilities, especially through enhancing Mind Blast with the second link connection, or enhancing the shadowy apparitions, which are naturally better at Cleave but still have some single target component to it. while also having some AoE value, especially when your AoE is starting to fall to lower target counts. And then I'd like to see the opposite of the AoE side just be like this pure single target burst. If I'm going into this tree, I might be able to pick up a little bit cleave, maybe a little bit of the early single target, so it's at least not nothing, but it's just single target is what I'm focusing on going over there, right? All right, so getting into the specific talents itself. Actually, before that, I want to look at I'm looking at these kind of in 3 sections of top, middle, and bottom, since that's kind of how the game defines them, right, with the point requirement system. So taking a look at this top area, I don't think this is bad, especially considering it's the beginning, but I think my biggest issue is I would like to see a few things moved. Makes no sense. Like, being able to theoretically not take VT or Devouring Plague in any circumstance feels really bad. Like, yeah, sure, if you're pure AoE, there are sometimes you wouldn't want VT, or sometimes you wouldn't want DP, but, like, in general, in 99% of situations, you need both of these talents, and them feeling like side paths, and especially with DP, there is no reason to take DP other than DP itself, right? Like, it just feels like such a bait trap where they should be switched. Personally, in my opinion, I would like to see DP actually move to this Vampiric Insight place. You know, it takes a little bit to get to it, sure, but, like, that is your bread and butter. You have to take this for every build. It unlocks the tree, and that's what I feel like DP really is, right? As that only huge impactful spender other than Searing Nightmare, and we all hate Searing Nightmare. We get into that later. I'd also don't like what Mindseer is in this. I'd much rather see, like, Mindseer and Vampiric Touch switched over, especially considering this is where Death and Madness is, but this is where all of your utility is. This is where your Fortress of the Mind is. Like, over, like, this side of the tree, this right side, it just feels necessary, right? Like, you need to be able to access the person when you need it. You need to be able to access Silence. You need to be able to access Fortress of the Mind in most scenarios outside of, like, pure AoE. It just feels much better if Vampiric Touch was the one that activated those. And then it goes the same with Death and Madness, right? Death and Madness is something you usually want in this mass AoE situation where you can get value out of sniping, but that's going to be where you need Mindseer, which is all the way over here. Obviously, you can get all of these because it's early in the tree, you have a lot of points to play with, but it just still feels bad but that those are where the gateways are, right? Other than that, I feel like up here, like I said, isn't too bad. I want to go over a few of the specific talents here now. Obviously, I already talked about the Mindseer placement, and personally, I don't like Mindseer as an ability because of how it combos with Searing Nightmare right now. Like, it's an okay filler ability, but I don't like how much emphasis they're putting into it because of Searing Nightmare, but that's more of a Searing Nightmare issue. One of the big things, our utility. I said I would address this, I will go ahead and get this now. Vampiric Embrace is not a button. It has this really cool idea, it has this really cool thematic, and I absolutely love it if it's good. But right now, it is not a button. It's so much overhealing, so much horrible healing decision or targeting. It just makes it not feel like a button. And it's kind of the same here. Because you look, and Shadow already doesn't have a lot of utility outside of its off healing, which is mostly the self-sustain through DP and Vampiric Touch, with a little bit of options for some healing with Shadow Mend, Powered Shield, or into other party members. Which I understand saying that that's its utility, but it just doesn't feel strong enough right now, right? And then you look at the utility options we have. Psychic Voice, I mean, it's a low cooldown fear, right? But fears really don't do that much. It can be like a sudden stopgap on 5 targets, which means it just won't work if you need to stop more than 5 targets, or if there's a bunch of RNG in a bunch of mobs being stacked together. Like, Fish Stick is a good example in Gambit right now. If you need to stop a Fish Stick, you can stand in the middle, right on top of the caster, to make it so it likely lands, but it is still RNG. But if you can stand in that exact perfect spot, if they're stacked up, to be able to hit the fear on the right target, which just devalues it, right? It feels more like a, oh shit, there's a bunch of things on top of me button, more than a useful utility button. And then Mind Bomb is a joke right now, man. I compared it to Cap Totem before, I compared it to Shadow Fury before. It is inherently just worse than those two abilities in a class that already doesn't have utility. Already doesn't have an actual interrupt, stuff like that. It just feels bad. And then technically this is a mid-row, but I want to talk about Hallucinations here since it's unlocked with Vampiric Embrace. It feels like Hallucinations doesn't have a purpose right now. Like, there was always that nice thing of, oh, I can't be damaging right now. I want to put some effort into healing, effort into dispelling, stuff like that, to give us a little bit for our wasted GCDs. Well, wasted GCDs. But, like, there is no way you're ever going to take it, especially with the Body and Soul change, where you will never run Body and Soul. You're going to run Vampiric, or, sorry, you're going to run Angelic Feather. Why would you ever take Hallucinations? It just gives so little value for how far into the tree it is, right? Other thing I want to talk about is Vampiric Insight. I think this is much better than the Dark Thoughts. Personally, again, unpopular opinion, I liked the Dark Thought component of cast while casting. Well, I won't say like, but I thought it wasn't that bad, right? And obviously that's what this is supposed to be, is it replaces that and just fully gets rid of the cast while casting while there, which again, I don't agree with that being the cast while casting they get rid of, but what do I know, right? I only play the class. I only know how it feels to play the class, right? And then just talking about silence here. Silence is so weak, man, in PvP, man. I talked about it in the other one, but it's this thing where blanket silences are not actually inherently as strong in PvE outside of very specific situations, where just like a baseline 24-second kicks with its usual lockout is just more value overall, especially in like M+, stuff like that. Again, we see some value from silence, right? Like Anduin ads are the perfect example I'm going to pull up, where you would have that blanket silence on a really fast cast, but overall, in most situations, silence is just too weak. What I would love to see instead, you see Last Words here reducing its cooldown, I would love to see that just fully change silence to just a standard range 24-second kick with a small lockout. That's it, not the blanket silence it currently is. I think that's about all. Oh wait, the big thing in the room, Searing Nightmare. Everyone has heard the arguments of it. No one particularly likes the way Searing Nightmare is right now. I would like to see it either take away the cast while casting and just make it a larger insanity dump with more damage, more impact, or just removed for some other AoE at this point. Searing Nightmare is unhealthy for the spec, and I don't think... There are very few Shadow Priests who want this cast while casting, turret, while mind searing playstyle in the game right now, right? It just feels terrible. Alright, so next let's skip to the middle rows. I think my biggest problem with the middle rows is there's a very clear lack of identity with a lot of these, right? Like, especially when you get down to these gateways, from what they lock out. It's like you're going into this spread cleave kind of niche, and then you're taking this really good AoE bust ability. And then you have this tree, which this tree is okay. Like, you're always going to go this tree. Like, these three talents, insane value for 1 talent point each. You're basically forced to take these in every build, right? And then over here on the right side, it gets very weird. Like, we'll talk about Monomania a little bit more later, but anything that enhances our feeler feels bad. And especially when that's what unlocks Void Turn, is these two abilities that increase Mind Flay damage. If these don't synergize with Void Turn as well, you get this situation where it's just not worth to ever cast Void Turn because it's worse than just channeling a Mind Flay, depending on balancing, and that just always feels bad, right? That'll always feels bad. The one thing I do want to talk about this middle row is these are 3 really strong talents, but it feels like these are the 3 talents that don't lead to your capstones, right? Like, you will always take these because of how strong they are, but they don't lead anywhere. Unless you're just completely foregoing an idol, which again, I think it's possible, but I'd much rather the idol be the, you want an idol in every build, that is what the builds are built around kind of thing. So it just feels bad when your only clear best middle row doesn't lead to your capstone. It's not the worst thing in the world as long as there's still a good path to get to the capstones. It just feels a little bit weird with how the tree is, with how bad the paths to get to the idols already are, right? Alright, getting into some of the more specific things. I want to look at Psychic Link first. Psychic Link feels like it's in a very weird position. I already talked about it earlier, where it is a gateway to all of these really strong mass AoE things, but it doesn't help in mass AoE because of the fact that you have to both Vampiric Touch everything, which you don't want to do in mass AoE, and cast Mind Blast, which you don't want to do in mass AoE. Again, it's really good for that, like, cleave playstyle, but just that mass AoE that this over here seems to be leading in outside of, like, the Vampiric, the Shadow Apparition buffs, just feels kind of weird, especially when you look at Shadow Crash being the next one. Like, is this, like, this is neither a cleave build or a mass AoE build, right? I just like to see this maybe moved over here and it be the unlocker to get in here, but obviously then it wouldn't unlock Capstone and runs into the same issues, right? Next specific thing I want to talk about is Surrender to Madness. This is just so weak. Insanity Generation just isn't what we need right now. I talked about it a little bit when I was talking about the Cthulhu earlier and the, I'll call it the Void Insanity issues. Insanity Generation doesn't help, especially when you look at Void Form right now. Void Form itself isn't really a impactful cooldown. It's this cooldown that synergizes really well and enhances your other cooldowns in specifically Mindbender and that PI'd Mindbender window, right? Like, there's a reason right now you would opt to have less Void Eruptions to cast it on the 2-minute cycle typically, right? And just feels bad when you get this ability that gives you more of that, but that in itself is not strong enough, right? Especially when it just, the other component is Insanity, and Insanity really is an issue right now. I want to talk more about, because I talked about the gateways a little bit. I don't think Shadow Crash or Void Torrent really lead to good gateway abilities. What I would like to see, and this is a little more theoretical, what they could do, and obviously there are going to be different opinions on this one. I would like to see these two actually move to be a stronger capstone ability, right? Like, you get your full capstone in like an Idol in the Zoth, and you have the option to go into Shadow Crash as like a rotation changing AoE button that is strong enough to be a capstone, just not forced to be taken, right? Because that's where you start to get meaningful choices, right? You have that one ability you have to take, and then you figure out what you can synergize with that ability afterwards. And I'd much rather see this as a choice of what to synergize than a gateway. And it goes with the same thing with Void Torrent. So what I would like to see is this is like a minor capstone at the bottom of the tree for an AoE ability, and this is a minor capstone for a single target or cleave ability. They're just stronger than what they currently are for being a capstone, but still not the defining point of the build, right? It kind of goes the same for Course. I think Course is a really good gateway, actually, unlike the other two, just because it's a little more generic. It has some uses in everything for what it goes into. I would prefer, instead of this being directly tied to Void, obviously it would still have to be tied to Void Eruption, but I would like to see this go into like an AoE gateway. Like, this is your gateway into whatever leads you into Idol in the Zoth and Shadow Crash and stuff like that, rather than it just kind of be in the middle here where it doesn't lead to anything major. Like, the other thing I have with this is there are things you are forced to take which feel kind of weird. Like, Shadow Apparitions is nothing about AS, which you can usually get. Damnation feels a little weird to me here because of Monomania being before, but I think Monomania itself just feels weird, same with Void Church. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I want to go into the bottom rows after that. And we're going to add Abyssal Knowledge and Rotten River to that. I've probably already said this more than enough times, but anything that increases our filler damage and increases our urgency to press a filler feels terrible for the spec. It doesn't feel good to take talents that are enhancing a button I only want to press when everything else is on cooldown. And it also approaches this point of, at what point does our filler become a major part of our rotation that starts to replace some of our builders like Mind Blast, some of our Spinders, and Void Bolts, right? It just feels really bad. And this is where I want to get down here, and this goes back into that gateway issue of these. It feels like these three are very weird bottlenecks. Like, Mind Vow and Insidious are okay if they have the right things leading out for it, but like, you have this bottleneck in Abyssal Knowledge to get to your idol, which just doesn't feel good and doesn't really synergize with the idols at all. It doesn't really do anything with the idols. Unless that... I didn't actually think of this before. They may be giving these to buff the Idol of Cthulhu Mind Flays. But I don't know. I still don't like that playstyle of you're buffing Mind Flay as a filler spell. Even if you're not the one casting it, I just don't really like that, if that is what they're going for here. But other than that, because then you have over here, which I'll talk about this more in detail later, but these two abilities are really bad, especially leading to an idol. These are so bad. This Mental Fortitude utility button should be nowhere near the bottom row. And this, I don't think should exist, but more about that later. The other big thing I want to talk about is I actually love these idols. I think the idols are the most appealing part of this tree. I want them to be good. I want them to be capstone abilities. I want to take one of these in every single build because they sound absolutely fun, beautifully thematic. They're not too intrusive. I'd actually rather see them change the rotation a little bit more than I feel like they will. But for the passive version they currently have, they all still sound interesting other than like the very generic aspect of the Eternal Call of the Void, but that's just because we had that for XU expansion. So when we go into BFA, I love the Eternal Call of the Void from Legion, right? And I was so happy for it to be back, but it just felt underwhelming, which I think is why I have a little bit of questions about it, but we have to see how it looks, right? And again, maybe there is some cool Mind Flay build where you're buffing your Tentacles Mind Flay, but it's only when you cast Mind Flay and Mind Seer have a chance to spawn it, right? So yeah, I just don't like that whole Mind Flay addition to it. I don't like Mind Flay being a main thing for anything. As for the specific things, let's just jump straight into these two. Why do they exist? I shouldn't say why do they exist. Okay, I will say, why does that exist? That should not exist. But why is this here? Why are we getting to the bottom of our tree, and one of our important 3 entryways to that tree, the only one that unlocks 2 of our idols, is this utility thing that does next to nothing and feels terrible. Especially when you consider that SFP is part of our main rotation now, meaning we're constantly pressing death, meaning this shield never holds for Sanguine Teaching. Which obviously these two are meant to synergize together, right? But they just feel so out of place here. And it's like 5 points blocking a capstone, but 2 things that feel like they have such little value, such situational value, and you feel bad taking these most of the time. Like, I look at all the fights for Sepultura right now, and obviously we could see a fundamental change in how they're designing fights, but I doubt that's going to happen because of how good the fights in Sepultura were. And both of these are just unbelievably hard to proc to full value to make it feel good to take these. I would be okay with Mental Fortitude remaining, but somewhere else, I think Sanguine Teaching has to go. Like, having that issue where you want people to be shielding you and wasting resources into you to keep you shielded just for damage, it just feels so degenerate. I don't like it. Alright, next thing, we've already talked about this a little bit. Abyssal Knowledge, rotten with it. Mind Flay, please no. Please do not make me a build where I have to press Mind Flay. I don't want it in my life. I want to press Mind Flay if I'm standing still with nothing else to cast. I don't want to press it because it is a good button to press. I want to press it because I've already pressed everything else, and I just need, like, AGCD for something else to come back up, right? Now, I want to go into some really good things here. The idols. I absolutely love the idols. Absolutely love them. They are very fitting. They each seem to have some clear idea for them, even if I don't particularly like them in the case of the Cthulhu Mind Flay increasing factors. Like, just look at these one at a time. Idol N'Zoth having that Echoing Void huge AoE benefit sounds awesome. Sounds like a really good ability. I would love to be able to play with this in AoE, right? Idol Shiraj I'm going to come back to later because that's actually my favorite one and I want to talk about it more. But we've already kind of talked about that Idol of Cthulhu. It has its cool, like I said, coming into Shadowlands when I saw that we were going to be using a token called the Void, I absolutely love Tindy's back from Legion. Still wish they were more impactful than they currently are, and I still don't like that they promote Mind Flay pressing. But I still like the idea of the Tentacles. It's thematic, having that little tentacle army attacking your target with you, stuff like that. And the Idol of Yogg-Saron, I absolutely love. Like, obviously we need to see more into that thing from Beyond, but just that idea of you're just slowly ramping up, and you hit this breakpoint where you just summon this really cool, for 20 seconds, damaging pet. Especially considering how this could be an issue to answer some of our urgency and damage profile. Like, that's 20 seconds. If that does enough damage and enough of your damage is centered in it, you just have this new bust window of you have SFP rolling while you have a thing from Beyond summon. I really am hoping they're going to let us control when we summon this a little bit better. You know, like, cancel the aura so we can get it better timing, stuff like that. But all of that is alpha stuff to be seen, right? Alright, so coming back to the Idol of Yashraj, and obviously we're going to need this because what the fuck does this thing do? It gives us a Lust Execute, first off. I absolutely love this. Especially considering right now how impactful Lust is to our class. It feels kind of bad that we're not using it in our best damage window in our Execute. So just giving us that as early above 80% as an Execute, I love this. Obviously, you need to be able to take it in a single target, and that's a completely different issue because right now I don't think it's takeable in single target. But I love this idea of increasing our damage and giving us a Lust Execute when everyone lusts to the pool, right? And giving us the De-Enrage with Anger. I do like this too. I'm still wondering to see how this interacts, if you can do multiple or if it's just a one with an ICD, stuff like that. But that's to be seen. I still like this as a cool little addition, right? The Sun one is kind of weird to me. Again, this comes with the issue of we're already generating too much insanity at some points, so generating more doesn't really feel good, but it is still something that looks cool. This both intrigues and worries me. The fun part about this one is, if something is feared and your Shadow Fiend is attacking it, not only do you deal increased damage, you do not break that fear, right? And we're not going to talk about the PvP worries of that because I'm not a PvP player, but obviously that's really bad. But I'm going to talk about the PvE Anduin implication. Like, imagine if we had this on Anduin right now. We could just full attack into one of the souls in the second phase, one of the casting souls, and it just will still never break the fear, right? So you can have a Warlock fear this, and you can just full pump into it. Full CDs, probably solo one, maybe two of them. Probably just one during the period of your Shadow Fiend, right? Like, it just has that effect of you can whittle down something that shouldn't be damageable while it's still CC'd because you don't want it to cast. A little bit worried, but also a little bit interested, because that actually gives a really good thing that Shadow can do, right? That gives a niche that other classes really wouldn't be able to do. And then just like a very generic increased Shadow Fiend, always at least has some use. That's pretty good, right? Like, as an idea, I love this Idol of Just Rush. I really hope that it's something that we can actually run in situations, but we'll have to see on that one, right? Alright, so next, two big things I want to talk about. As I want to talk about the gateways again. Insidious Aya and Mind Devourer, I think, especially compared to like Mental Fortitude, these are two really good entries to the tree, right? Like Insidious Aya, I don't like its placement right now, but it's just that really good single target. You're never feeling bad taking this in single target or cleave if you're using it to enter the bottom tree. Same with Mind Devourer, you never feel bad taking this in single target or cleave just to enter this bottom part of the tree. I think these are really good gateway. I think more things need to take this, like, it obviously has a focus, but it's also good enough to apply to a general situation to enter as a gateway into another row. And the last thing I really want to talk about addressing the Shadow Tree is these bottom, specifically these two abilities right here. These Capstone, bottom of the tree, obviously they're not supposed to be as impactful as Idols or Living Shadow, but what is their purpose here? They're both very passive, they both feel like they don't do a lot, they're both very underwhelming for being the bottom of the tree, right? And like, I get it, not everything can be major Idol of Cthulhu game-changing kind of things, or a game-changing kind of design, but these just, they feel a little too generic, a little too weak, a little too passive to be the very bottom of the row. Compared to that, Living Shadow, I actually really do like Living Shadow. Obviously, we need to see how it works. I think right now we're assuming it works like the Holy Legendary, where it'll kind of mimic if you're casting single target, cast single target, if you're casting AoE abilities, stuff like that. But we'll have to actually see how that works on Alpha. Out of the capstones, Living Shadow is okay. I think it's still more of a minor capstone, but we'll have to see how balancing works. But I think this is the last... I said that I was done with that tree, but there's one big thing I want to talk about and how the idols work. I don't like how the idols work right now. I understand that they wanted to prevent you from being able to take two idols, but I'd rather see like a 4-choice idol and then a few branching paths depending on how you want to augment those idols. You know, like, do you want a little bit more AoE to go with your idol? Do you want a little more single target cleave to go with your idol? Rather than see the idols just force furthest away they can be in the tree. You require 5 full points to get to either of them. Because I feel like that's part of the problem with the Abyssal Knowledge and the Sanguine Teaching and all that, is they saw this. They saw that, okay, we want to have 4 idols, but we only want to make them choose between 2 of them if they pick a node, but we can't let them have 2 idols. So what's the solution? Okay, we put some random filler spell with a shite ton of points right before the idol so they can't take both of them, right? Because, like, by the time you get 20 points to be able to get down here, you have 10 points left. It would take 11, or it takes 5 points to unlock an idol plus another one to get it. So you could never actually get the 2 idols with those 10 points, right? And that's kind of that's what I feel like these are for. I just hate that there's such weak abilities that do it. And I feel like the tree would just be so much easier to clean up if you just combined all the idols into one 4-choice. Or even just made it like what they do with the Zendalari Trolls, where you go to a certain place, like some cool void form or void-based kind of area, like the Waking City. I think it's still there somewhere. I don't know if... Actually, I'm pretty sure the entire realm just appeared, but you could just recreate a realm like that, where you just actually go to the different idols and select it from there, as opposed to needing to select it in the talent tree itself. But I think that's something I would love to actually see them look into more, honestly. Just let us choose one of the 4 idols instead of having all 4 of them separated in the tree, so that it just increases the variability you're able to do into the tree and how clean you're able to make it, compared to what it is right now of forcing you to put so many points in just to get those idols that I feel like every build should want, if they're working out the way that, at least the way I like to see it. I think that's about all I have to say on the Shadow Tree, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get into just some generic builds for stuff like that. Starting with the Clash Tree, then we'll move into the Shadow Tree after, so let's go ahead and get into that. Alright, so I want to start with more of a generic look at the Priest Clash Tree itself, because like I said, the builds for this are very generic, right? They're very defaulted. You have your 2 damage-orientated capstones in Shadowfang Prism and Mind Games, and you will always go for those. You can debate taking away the Mind Games and Type Evasion for some more utility, or even a mind control dominant mind playstyle to get the Puppet Master uptime. But for the most part, when you're starting off from the tree, you're always going to want to take Angelic Feather because having some ability as Shadow Priest is just necessary. You don't like taking it, but you have to take Mind Restraint to get into PI, which is way too important, as well as Twist of Fate. From here, you have a few points you need to start spending. You can easily just throw the 1 into Death, which gives you an unlock of the middle row. You're always going to take the Shadow Fiend, Improved Shadow Fiend to walk towards that SFP, and then Puppet Master is the first optional thing, but you're always still going to want to take it just because this is one of the few very dominantly DPS lines in this talent tree. And obviously, if you're taking PI, you always have to have Twin of the Sun Priestess. It just goes too well with PI to ever not have this, right? It just feels grief if you have PI and not have this. From here, we need to spend 2 more points to actually unlock the bottom here, and we're actually going to go ahead and spend 3 just because you have the improved Mind Blast here, which is the CD on Mind Blast that is currently inherently baked into Shadow itself, and just more Mind Blast is just way too impactful for the class to not always have these 2 points. Right, and from here, you just default unlock your 2 major capstones, right? Like you get your Shadow Flame Prison and everything that leads up to that. You get your Mind Games and everything that leads up to that. And this last point is just a random utility point. You can maybe put it into a little bit more healing with the Prayer of Mending. You can put it into Shackle if you need the Shackle, Mind Control if there's something that's actually valuable to Mind Control, but typically this defaults Leap of Faith. And again, you can always take away these 2 Mind Games, or these 3 points right here in Mind Games and Type Evasion, which just gives you a little bit more play. You can go for the Dominant Mind in M+, you can go for a little bit more healing, something like that, just a little bit stronger off healing. But typically, I imagine this is what you're going to want for almost any situation, and at least from what we have right now, I can't imagine this changes much. I feel like you just default to this unless you have a very specific reason not, right? Alright, let's get into the Shadow itself now. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about with Shadow itself is just this generic, no matter how many builds I tried to look into, I tried to put the points into, I always found myself coming back to this same generic base. Like up here, obviously you're very locked into what you need, right? You need Vampiric Touch for almost basically every content. You need Devouring Plague, you don't need Mind Seer, but it just leads into way too many powerful options to not have it. Like you can't not take Mind Seer because it leads into Silence, it leads into Dispersion, it leads into a better way than Mind Bomb to get into Vampiric Insight, as well as unlocking Fortress of the Mind for single target specifically, but you'll notice that isn't devoted right now just because you didn't really need this in AoE, but anything not AoE, you're always going to take Fortress of the Mind, right? Anything not just pure Mong AoE, like M+, basically. Then we get to these middle trees. Is the first thing you'll notice is you always have to take this Void Eruption tree, right? You'll never not want Void Eruption, and you'll never not want Hungering Void, you'll never not want Ancient Madness. They're just way too powerful for the low amount of points you need to spend, and with how many points you need to spend at this point to get to the bottom row. You notice we also go into Shadowy Apparitions, Auspicious Spirits, Monomania, and Damnation. That's just more of there are certain points you have to spend 20 points. And from here, you'll notice even if you take both of these to try to get into the bottom row, outside of going just straight into Insidious Aya, that's still only 3 more points spent, putting you at 18, right? You still have to come back and find 2 more points to spend somewhere. So it just feels like no matter where you start with Shadow, you're always starting with this. There is no choice up to this point because the amount of points you need to spend and the way the class tree is set up, you will always just have this very generic, you're starting here, and from here you actually start to be able to make some decision, right? Alright, so the way I'm going to break these up is every single one of the builds from this point, I have a idle version and a non-idle version. Like I said, I would like for every single build to be based off 1 capstone idle, but just in case it isn't worth putting the points into the more feels bad fillery talent points like Sanguine Teaching and Abyssal Knowledge, I went ahead and included 1 version of each. The one I want to talk about first is the idle version of Single Target. So as for the idol, you would want to go for it. I would love to be able to go for Yashiraj as an option, but obviously there's just so many points you'd have to dedicate into non-single target abilities that it just doesn't feel right to do it. So we're going to be left with the Idol of Cthulhu and the Idol of Yogg-Saron for single target. I've addressed my issues with Idol of Cthulhu already. I don't like it particularly. It puts more emphasis on Flay, it increases insanity generation we don't need. So these will all be focusing on the Idol of Yogg-Saron. The first build that I have here, and there's actually 2 variants of the Idol of Yogg-Saron build that I see. The first one also gets us Living Shadow. So obviously, you had your generic Clash tree from earlier, or generic Shadow tree from earlier that I start every single spec baseline as. We pick up the Fortress of the Mind, Void Touch, and Void Torrent, mostly because we need to spend 5 more points to get into the 20 requirement from what we saw earlier, but also just because Fortress of the Mind is a really strong single target talent. Void Torrent is typically a pretty strong single target talent, and the rest are obviously just gateways. We're able to pick up Mind Devourer here, which feels pretty good. We have to pick up the Abyssal Knowledge to get to the idol in the first place. Feels bad, but what can you do? This entire thing is assuming the idol is strong enough to still pick up this Abyssal Knowledge. And then we pick up Rotten River. Again, I don't think Rotten River is that great single target, but it is the best way to get to Living Shadow if you're also taking the idol. And you have 1 point left over. I personally like going Insidious Aoe with that. One thing you'll notice is you have the option of taking Dispersion out for Malediction, and that's something with most of these builds. You can take Dispersion out for like 1 more point in something random, DPS-wise, but I think Dispersion is strong enough that you will almost always want it in every build. Like, obviously, the pure DPS variant is going to drop Dispersion since it's just a talent that has nothing to do with damage, but in a realistic sense, you always want that talent, right? Alright, so as for the next single target I want to look at is the one... There's a world where we don't want to take Living Shadow here because it also requires us to take Rotten River, right? In that place, I think that you definitely put the point in Insidious Aoe, and then you have these 2 points remaining, and you kind of have 3 places you can go with it, right? You can go for the Malediction, which I don't think this one will be strong enough to go. It's just there as an option. Or you go into Unleash the Shadows or Intuition. Now, the reason I can't choose between these two right now is they both have merit to funnel into Idol of Yogg-Saron. Unleash the Shadows obviously synergizes with all of the Metamania and Abyssal Knowledge perks of Bind Flay, increasing your dots, haste ticks, and crit rate to get more crits for more shadowy apparitions through Vampiric Touch. Then you look at Intuition, and again, we don't know the actual percent values on how likely these are to happen, which makes it much more awkward to judge this. But it'll work like Dark Touch does now, where you get that proc for the extra Mind Blast, that also is going to give you more apparitions. And I think which one of these two you go for really depends on how well they are funneling into the Idol of Yogg-Saron and how strong that Idol of Yogg-Saron actually is with its thing from beyond. I think that's about it for the single target build. Again, there are a few small variations I can see, but I think for the general sense, the single targets will kind of follow that build path. Alright, so now we've seen the idol version, I want to go into the version without an idol, and this is basically, it just isn't worth putting the 3 points here. So we just forego the idol entirely, get those 3 points back, and we put them into more influential things. You'll see here that I opted for Living Shadow still. Again, I think that that will be a strong enough spell that you want it if you can get it, right? I went over it just now. It does feel like a strong spell if it works the way we think it does, and it actually just focuses single target spells. You notice that not putting the points here allows me to pick up Idolic Intuition fully, as well as Unleash the Shadow a little bit. But more importantly, it lets me put that last point into the Talbador Stratagem version, Insidious Aoe. And basically, I can still see some worlds. Like I said, I really don't like Rotten River. I can see a world where Idolic is weak enough, you would drop this, take Malediction, it lets you drop this, and you can still get Living Shadow and Void of Apparition, just without any of those. And I guess you do still get 1 point in it, because you really just have that extra point. You could also use that point for more utility somewhere up here. You know, something like Intangibility, maybe Abyss Knowledge is strong enough with 1 point, even though it feels bad to me, stuff like that, right? That's about it for single targets. Alright, so next I want to talk about more of a cleave build, and this build is going to be centered around the idol first. So the idol you choose here, I kind of see a world where Idol of Yogg-Saron is, and I'll get into that later with more of a funnel build, but it's just so hard to get there if you're talking about just pure, every target is even, you want to do the same amount of damage to everything cleave. So I looked more towards the Idol of Yashiraj, which I would like to be the main cleave thing. I still see a world where N'Zoth just is valuable enough, especially on stacked cleave, at a certain target point, it just fully overtakes the Idol of Yashiraj and the SFP value it gives. But again, it's very easy to switch these two idols, right? Like, they're very interchangeable in the build. There's not really that much of a change. But what we did with the cleave build from where we originally were, we sort of decided to go into Fortress of the Mind because, again, we need the 2 extra points on top of sending into Psychic Link and Shadow Crash. And again, this is one of the reasons I don't like Shadow Crash here. Shadow Crash feels really bad in non-stacked cleave. Again, I know that they are very hesitant on doing more spread cleave fights. That's something Blizzard has said they don't like. I still don't like the fact that option isn't there, though, to go into more of a spread cleave thing, just in case. But if Blizzard holds up that end of the bargain of no spread cleave fights, it's not that bad. So we have that. Obviously, the Fortress of the Mind is because it's still somewhat single target oriented, because you still have some of your single target spells going. You still have a large emphasis on Mind Blast because of the cleave it does with Psychic Link, stuff like that. From there, you regrettably have to take these two because it's the only way to get to this idol. I still don't like these two abilities. I've already voiced that. And then you'll just see picking up a lot of the Unleash Shadow, Shadow Apparition type of things. One thing I notice here for the stacked versus the spread cleave is this Living Shadow. The way I imagine Living Shadow works is if you're casting that AoE spell, it's mimicking an AoE spell itself, right? So like if you're doing Mind Seer, it just gets very little value because of the spell that it's copying for the Mind Seer is only hitting one target in spread cleave. Well, I think it'll be very strong in stacked cleave. I think if you're looking spread cleave, you look for something more like the Insidious Aya. And one thing I will say, in both of these builds, Void Apparition, I feel like, is debatably weak enough that you may just put the point into Insidious Aya. Or even just take the point in Unleash for Void Apparitions, drop Unleash completely, and just go Insidious Aya, just for the extra Psychic Link damage. I guess it depends on the tuning of Shadowy Apparitions, tuning of Mind Blast, and stuff like that. Those are just kind of like the two routes I see you going for Cleave if you're taking an idol for it. Next, I want to look at Cleave if you're not taking an idol. If you're not taking an idol, the first thing you'll notice is that whole debate I just had about the Shadowy Apparitions and Mind Blast no longer becomes a thing because you just naturally get both of them, right? You naturally get Insidious Eye. That's one of the things about not taking idol in this build, or just for this class in general, is it lets you take every single one of your non-idol bottom trees. And again, the only thing you're really losing talent-wise other than the idols for that in any build is Mind Devourer, which has a lot less value in that AoE perspective, though I do still like it in Cleave a little bit, so it sucks we can't go that far into it, but that's still fine, because it is still mostly a single target spell. But what you'll see here is, from the generic base, we were able to still pick up Psychic Link, and this is one of those things where if this is spread Cleave versus single target Cleave, I 100% would take Shadow Crash away to add a point into Malediction for that extra damnation, getting extra dots out on a spread Cleave target. But again, spread Cleave is likely not going to happen from Blizzard Dice. So you see from the generic base, we were able to pick up those. We were able to still pick up Fortress of the Mind just so we have enough points to go through. And then we were able to take Insidious Aya, Unleash Shadows, Void Apparitions, and Living Shadow, all of which should have very good value in Cleave. This also lets us take a Rotten River, which, again, I don't like Mind Flay, Mind Seer alterations or buffs, but this does feel very good in a Cleave situation with multiple targets, just because it is sitting there extending your dots whenever you're Mind Searing as that open filler to get more Insanity because you don't have a Mind Blast up, and you just need the Insanity for DP. So it does feel good to have Rotten River in this Cleave multi-target situation, as long as they're stacked enough for Mind Seer to be ticking on all of them. And then you're able to pick up Intuition here as well. Again, this is a balanced question of it's still so hard for me to judge anything with Intuition and Vampiric Insight without seeing the percent chances it currently has, right? But that's a balanced thing that we'll be able to get our hands on when we have Alpha. Alright, so last thing I want to look at is more of the AoE with an idol versus not with an idol issue. You notice that it is very similar to the Cleave, if not almost exactly the same. The big differences you'll notice is opting for Death and Madness over Fortress of the Mind. And then that extra point, I went into Malediction here. I see a world where you also go into Fortress of the Mind, right? Just because it also is still increasing that Psychic Link damage for when you start to fall below that Searing Nightmare spam target count. But for the most part, the issue with AoE feels it's very incoherent how many abilities we have for AoE. Like, if you actually look at the talent tree, our AoE is Echoing Void from N'Zoth, Shadow Crash, Searing Nightmare, Ancient Madness. Nothing else really synergizes with that AoE idea. Like, you'll see that I have up to Living Shadow because that is also a pretty good AoE ability, but the points into, like, Void Apparitions just feels bad. In fact, I'd probably usually rather that into more of a funnel situation, especially for when targets start dying, into Insidious Eye instead of that. But you notice, like, the Unleash of Shadows, you're not going to be touching a lot of things in AoE anyway, so that's going to give no value, but you have to take it for Living Shadow. Psychic Link, you're not going to be blasting things in mass AoE, so this is giving very little value. The AoE just... It's much like AoE on live right now. The AoE just feels like it's not there. It feels like our AoE is supposed to be a component of our Cleave, and it's just not there. Alright, so now looking at a more non-idol focus, and you'll notice, again, this is very similar to the Cleave build, basically, but with Searing Nightmare. The only difference you can really see here is that we take away the points in Fortress of the Mind to go for Death and Madness over the no-idol Cleave build. We get the point in Malediction because it at least is just another fast way to apply a Vampiric Touch while things are still being grouped before you can start into your Mindseer channel. You have Rotten Wither, which is very useless here, but there's not really much else you can take. Like, this is one of those sad situations where I can honestly see you taking away these points and even putting the points into Sanguine Teaching because you can at least... Actually, that still gives no value in AoE too, right? And just putting it in Fortress of the Mind just for when things start dying, and then you just have these 2 points that feel like they're not doing anything. I could see a world where instead of putting the points into Rotten Wither, you just take Psychic Voice and go for Unfurling Darkness again, just so you have that little bit extra. You get 1 more VT out before everything is grouped and you enter the Searing Nightmare spam. But the AoE just feels very incoherent, and I really don't like where it is. I don't really want to talk about it too much, because I'm really hoping we see some changes with our AoE, but that's about where I'll leave the Spectries. And that's about all I had to really go over today. Went a little bit longer than I would have liked, but there's just a lot of information here, especially when we can't actually test things, so a lot of it is still speculative, especially with the theory crafting of builds. Like I said, I think it's a good start as long as they listen to feedback. There's definitely some work to be done, but we just need them to listen to feedback, and they can make this into something pretty good. With that being said, go ahead and call this here. If you look down in the description and you like this content, be sure to check out my Twitch, where I stream at least a Mythic Clear every week, usually 2, 1 on Shadowpiece, 1 on Lock. And every once in a while I'll do a random stream. I definitely plan on doing a lot more alpha content when that comes out, but that should hopefully be within the next couple weeks or so. I imagine that it's not too far out, but other than that, thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you all later.